this live now, or is this live in 15 minutes? I guess it's live now. I haven't figured out the function for the schedule for later, but oh well, doesn't matter. Here we are. And Christos Yannaras, and the parable of the soils. First thing I want to say is a word picture. We have the language of this corner of the internet, all right? So we have a vertical and a horizontal line. Now I want to add the idea or the image of that small square up in the corner showing 90 degrees. And this square up in the corner of this little internet is the conversation about consciousness, meta-language, cognition, the movement that not merely is physical or merely is not physical in the sense of billiard balls crashing against, buffeting the walls, and some falling into a hole. That sort of Humean empirical notion, and to extend that on a normal line of history, well, history just is the linear movement of avatar after avatar before some historical revolution of the billiard balls and some sort of guru type figure walking across the wooden floor of outer history to grab the billiard ball, bring it back, and redefine everything until we all come to the sudden realization that we're playing pool again. And then seeing that againness as a retreat into conservatism. That sort of notion of history is boring. And I think in this square of this corner of the internet, the intimations of how boring the Humean empirical data structure is being dismissed. There are more things to do with a pack of cards than make a three-dimensional Tower of Babel. And so, meta-language, I think, finds its fit in that wide panorama of a problematic. So what is meta-language? Well, what is metania, metanoia, repentance? Beyond what's been handed down to us through America, through the capital feedback loop of when you open your eyes, it's a matter of time until you're a teenager with a backpack on, and then you have to remove the backpack and be somebody for 4 years, and then leave that place after 4 years and go to another place for 4 years where you're a student at a university, working towards a degree, like a bubble coming to the top of the surface of water and then popping out into your role in society where you show up 8 to 5, or you show up in many different places if you're a digital nomad, which is a phrase I quite enjoy. And you do this until, well, instead of 4 years after 4 years, decade after decade, you're able to retire into a kind of laid back chair existence, ironically, billiard ball rolling back into the original position of not the cradle, but the grave. This idea of capital in a settled place is not interesting. It's certainly not this corner of the square of this corner of the internet, to my eyes. So what is movement without that capital myth of the return to the cradle via the grave after putting in your sweat equity of crunching numbers with your degree? Not that there's anything wrong with a degree or specialization or professionalism or any of these things. They're fine. We need airplanes to land. We need surgeries to be performed. It's nice to have a root canal. These things are fine. But how does that change the symbol? How does that contort the meta-language? Here we find elbow room for Christos Yannaras. I was at a restaurant last night and I was drinking coffee and I came across this paragraph on hierarchy. Let me read it to you, and then we will go into the parable of the soils, which I see as a kind of neo-Euclidean trademark of how to derive movement from something more than Humean empiricism. So if that interests you, stay put and follow me. Let's go. Or suggest something in the chat about what it might mean, if you wish. Doesn't matter. But it does matter, and it doesn't matter. We're here discussing things. In this semi-personal, semi-translucent, semi-permanent space of the internet. But here's that, without digressing, here's that place in the book where, as I was sipping coffee, I was silently, imperceptibly leaping within myself through excitement at what he put his finger on, or what his translator put the finger on. Here it is. Let me find it. It's in the subsection on analogy and hierarchy. I'll find it in 1 second. There we go. Okay. Here's the statement. Here is the statement. Now, before I make the statement, I want to put it in another context. I'm all about the dolls and the dolls and the dolls and the dolls and the dolls. One of my commenters a few videos back asked about the difference between the East and the West in terms of the use of substance or the use of hypostasis. And certainly, we want to look at words. As Slavoj Žižek said, words matter because, if I can quote him correctly, words matter because they define the contours of what we can do. Now, what does that mean? It will take time to tease out the implications of that sentence. But how to approach the question of the East and the West, of different terminologies for theological expressions, and what we're trying to achieve when we notate an experience. The notation of experience, the expression of a linguistic signifier. I know these are terms, but duality. How does the form and the function meet? So, all these things simply represent themselves, and we can call that history or we can call it something else. Either way, we're begging the question of what our implicit understanding of history is as we progress in our understanding of how these terms work together to build up a notion of space and time for ourselves and our loved ones to inhabit together and move within and make progress. All of those words in that sentence defy explanation to a certain extent because they're so imbibed with a precursor condition of our understanding of history, which is to say, our encapsulatedness in a tradition. This is the movement of, what's that book that Mr. Paul van der Clay gave attention to, special attention to, and I'm grateful for it because I think it's an important book. Anyway, he's a historian, and he writes about how in the liberal West we can't help ourselves but be Christians culturally. That book, that movement, that argument, in its technical existence, is the splitting of the pool balls across the table, but in a meta way, showing no matter what you try to do, pool cue behind the back, pool cue between the fingers, pool cue over somebody else's head, doing a Robin Hood and jumping the white ball over the balls towards something, whatever trick you're playing the trick on a pool table. So no matter what neologisms you're making up, no matter what psychoanalytic contortion you are performing on this high wire of transference to a patient, no matter what sort of mass paranoia or indoctrination or propaganda is seeping through the circuits of a database, whether in a corporation or in society at large, or in frequent hours spent on the internet, or in the books we read, or in the cinema we attend, whatever. This is still all being performed on a common surface. And that common surface is what? And the question mark at the end of that what is the argument of that book. And it's an appeal to metaphysics. It's an appeal to logic. It's an appeal to, I think, three things. And over the course of this week, I was thinking to myself, because I'm circumambulating to the parable of the soils, I've been saying to myself, I don't want to look at the parable of the soils. And I'll tell you why I find that parable so interesting in a moment. I don't want to look at the parable of the soils as a description of agriculture. Because I can go on Google Maps and find agriculture. I can look at map, terrain, static images of a field in France, a field in China, a field in America. I can look at the snow fields of Antarctica. Or better yet, I can imagine them with those words. I could read Hesiod's Days and Years, his Theogony. I can compare different ways of describing natural landscapes through a painting, some huge Gothic description or picture of a cloud, and feel this sense of conspansive awe, the sublime. But this is never-ending intellectual pool cue, hitting the ball, hitting other balls, moving and buffeting off walls into some holes. It's intellectual empiricism. It's symbolic empiricism. Hume repeats himself through the symbolic world. If all we do is juxtapose and compare our insights with our methods, with our first causes. If that's all we do, we're lining up the dominoes to fall in the same direction every time. So let us not, in our widening and deepening of the symbolic world, metalanguage appreciation for how complex experience is, to a reverting, a refrain to Hume's original problem a couple hundred years ago. Because some people call Hume a materialist. Oh, he was talking about billiard balls, he was talking about teacups, he was talking about all these things that you can't combine together except in a bundle of perceptions through the human eye, the human ear, the human interface. The manifold of all those material strata are combined in what is allowable or permissible for the human interfacing, not through some preordained harmony or causal interlinks that are just so and refined in an this will be hard to say, anthropomorphic winking of the eye, but they're just bundles of perceptions, bundles of senses. And so how do I separate the ability of my eye having an optic nerve to my brain to that cup of tea with a little bit of steam rising from the top? How do I disentangle those identities? For Hume, or for certain interpreters of Hume, that's a problem that can be dismissed with pastime, with a game of backgammon with a friend. And just don't think about it. Because thinking about it will lead you to an impasse, an aporia, a knot that cannot be untied, an ultra-Gordian knot. So just don't think about it. Don't practice philosophy. Be someone recreational, which I think laid the seeds for, or put the fertilizer on the ground to encourage massive, rapid growth of the Nietzschean Übermensch, or the Nietzschean Superman, right? The notion that, well, if we can't find the answer, because we'll only find ourselves in mazes if we try to find the answer, then let's make it up as we go along. And people who can make it up higher than others, well, let's cling on to them and maybe climb up to their shoulders. I don't see those two movements as far apart. But again, I think it's a repetition of Hume's empiricism, only with concepts being the matter, not teacups and sunrises. So we don't want to make our symbols atoms, because then we might implicitly confuse them with materials. So this line from Christos Yannaras now, I think, finds its place. And it's in subsection 73, hierarchy as teletarchy, as the ordered perfection of the transmission of knowledge. The notion of analogy as hierarchy was interpreted definitively in the Areopagitical writings of the 5th century. So where are we? We're in the 400s. Much work has been done by scholars to identify the Platonic and Neo-Platonic sources used by the author. Now there's a footnote in what author is he referring to? 216. He quotes many different books in a different language. But in all these quotations of different books with different languages, Lasky's here et al., we find Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, which if I go a few footnotes back, I see Dionysius the Areopagite on the celestial hierarchy. So now we're approaching Mr. Jonathan Peugeot. These things are connected, and I want to see the connection, because I think rather than the word understanding, which has in it the vertical metaphor, under, below, standing. So I'm standing below someone on a catwalk. I'm standing below the cloud. Give me rain. Give me understanding. Which is fine. I like the Greek word asynesis, or whatever it is, S-Y-N and then some other thing, which is to say, like a symbol, like symmetry, it's a combining of something. Understanding, yes, you're standing under something. The high and the low, they're connected through a pole or whatever, a ladder, which you don't see the ladder, but you see the connection. That's the difference between a tree and a ladder, by the way. You see a tree, you don't see a ladder. A ladder is more refined tree. That'll be in the parable of the soils a little bit later. Understanding or intelligence is the connecting of things together for beauty, for harmony, for attraction and repulsion of that which does not fit right now in this place. It's attention, as Peugeot would say, standing in attention for what is not I, and yet what includes myself voluntarily, because we want to include the will as well. All of this, you'll notice as we go along, you won't find me putting things on a whiteboard. You'll find perhaps a lot of noise, but maybe in that noise, something pungent that might conspire with your experience, and there you ripple out through your own person. And that is communication, is it not? So back to Yannaras, but from a systematic point of view, the idea of hierarchy, as analyzed in the Areopagitical writings, Dionysius the Areopagite on the celestial hierarchy, 400s, 5th century, this is where we are, finds its proper place in Byzantine theology. Where is Byzantium? Byzantium, Byzantium. Why do people talk about Byzantium on the internet? I don't know. Why do people talk about the south of France? It's a destination. It's a place. It's a sort of fictional worldview, sunrise, sunset. You know, it's an escape. But what does Yannaras mean by Byzantine here? He means where it has been integrated into the whole WHOLE structure of the church's teaching. Analogy as hierarchy. This is the second paragraph. Knowledge as a power analogous to the stages of existential perfection or the transcendence of alienation. Yannaras' style, or the style of his translator, is to put a lot of words together. Now, I know in the Greek language, it's morphological. So in one word, you see its case, you see its verb, its tense. You see a lot of things in a single word because you see the shape of the action. Rather, you see the shape of the reference. You see the direction of the intention. You see movement in a single word in the Greek language. Whereas in English, with its syntax, what you see is a stringed out, beaded performance. You do not see all of it in a single thing. You have to go through the syntax of English in order to arrive at an understanding or at a connection in which you find yourself situated via the movement or through the. Let me put it simply. In the English syntax, because it's not word-specific morphologically, you have to move through the sentence to arrive at the situation you find yourself in through the syntax. And this is one of the reasons why English syntax is prizing movement as opposed to the prizing of vision. Vision is assumed in the English syntax as arrival in a situation through the movement. You open a door, you walk in the room, there you are. Right there, that little sentence exemplifies what I'm trying to say, or exhibits what I'm trying to say. Whereas in a morphological language, the room, the door, the movement in now is presenced in the word. And you can tease out, implicate, deconstruct the articulation. And I think this is one of the understandings for idea, a Greek word. So an idea is a vision. It's the seeing. It's like the Latin video. But unlike the way to experience a vision in English, which is a movement through, there's a channel metaphysical mathematics, or mathematical metaphysics, forgive me. It's a wonderful channel. He talks about how language entrances us. We are in a trance when we speak. And I would only add to that, as an addenda, the English language in particular, since in its syntactical construction asks us to perform a movement through, really brings that out. How you can't really speak English without being in a trance until the period, the end of the sentence. Whereas with a morphological language, you don't have to be entranced. You are given the idea, and then what? Well, now you're in a position to think about, so hear that language, to think about the idea. Already it's starting to develop a circular formation with the point in the center. Maybe this is why geometry came out of the area around Greece. That is to say, maybe the activity of geometry is the activity of thinking morphologically, of contemplating, or seeing contemplation under the light, under the microscope of morphology. So, for example, when people say, why were all the philosophers Greeks? They weren't all Greek. But why do we associate philosophy with Greek? The word itself, philosophy, is a Greek word. Why does it seem to have most of its roots in that language? I do not pretend to know, but I think one of the things that gives it away, in the same way that when you look at a piece of wood shaped with a horse's head and a circular base, you might be able to say to yourself, if you've had the experience of playing chess, that's a chess piece. Sure, it's wood, and I could throw it into the fire and it would add maybe a flame or two of fuel, but it's much better spent on the black and white board at making its proper movements. I would get much more mileage out of the bishop if that was how this particular item was used, as opposed to throwing it in the fire and adding a flame or two. In the same way, what I mean by intellectual movement is what I think the board game of morphological sentence structure gives us, in the same way that a chessboard gives us movements parameterized for these pieces, as opposed to a fire which just engulfs and eats and builds itself up. The Greek language, or any language that's morphological, because it's all already articulated, compacted, you see everything it's trying to say at once. And so it encourages you not to be entranced, but it encourages you, it incites you to think about, to move around this solid shape and notice things about it. And in this noticing about, you reconstruct the idea yourself. So confronting the object, the idea, leads to a mediopassive, a middle voice. What I mean by that is when you walk on the street, if you're walking yourself, that means exactly same here, Anselman. I'm just thinking out loud. When you walk down the street, in the middle voice, you might be walking yourself. Now that's strange if we're materialists and we say, well, you're not walking yourself. You would walk a dog. The dog would have a chain to it. By walking myself, I mean that I am influencing the action that I am the object of. I am going for a walk, period. But you might also say, I'm going for a walk myself. No one is compelling me to walk. So we find a description of the freedom of the will in the middle voice. My point is, when you come up to that object and you begin to describe it, notice things about it, pluck a little bit from it and notice. You're doing that yourself in the same way that you would walk yourself. You're doing it in the middle voice. And you could do that indefinitely long. This is Peterson's claim of you can look at a square on the floor and notice everything. Or in the same manner, to speak algorithmically, you could spend every waking moment of your life noticing something new about that square on the floor. There are all these little details. In the same way, you can do that with an idea until you stop. And then when you stop, you have some construction. And then the question, here we go, the meta question about that process which you have composed, to borrow language from category theory, that thing you have composed that you've arbitrarily stopped composing because you're tired of thinking about the idea, is what? What is that thing? You might ask your neighbor, you might ask your friend, what do you think of these ideas in my head? You're comparing notation. You're comparing notes. Oh, what'd you think of that movie last week? In other words, how is your experience carved from the marble of the idea, what you have between your ears, and how different is it from mine? When did you stop? And why? And possibly the why is more important than the when. And the what. It's the telos. And we're comparing, well, Pinocchio and the whale, to me, that means this thing I remember from my childhood. Oh, to me, it reminds me of this lecture I heard from Jordan Peterson. Are they connected? Well, who knows? Maybe we'll throw away the constructions. And maybe we'll spend the rest of our lives just constructing and constructing and constructing and constructing. Maybe that's what the mind does. But how different does that sound from what David Hume was talking about when he said, oh, all these causal connections that are putatively out there. I'm tired of your methods. Let me go play backgammon. Let's dismiss the problem of how the world's connected in a harmonious whole and just go play backgammon. We can do the same thing with our intellectual constructions, of course. And that's one of the reasons why I would say David Hume is here to stay. So that's the inducement to metalanguage. It's not this pie in the sky ivory tower game that some people play. Metalanguage is what we do all the time. Metalanguage is experience carving up from the marble of an idea what we think about it, and then comparing notes. In whatever square of whatever corner you find yourself in, and that is society. So if metalanguage is inevitable, what should we do with it? I don't know. But as an Orthodox Christian, I am excited to think about this prospect through the Gospels. And what has caught my attention, and the thing I'm carving out, and have been for a few days, is the parable of the soils and what they could mean in this context. So I was going to read about hierarchy from here, but now let's just go to the parables of the soil, the parable of the soil, and then be done with it for today. I mentioned Euclidean geometry earlier. On the other side of that, Have in your mind the scientist who goes out in the world and looks at facts and wants an explanation behind the fact for the fact, so that he might be able to see around the corner what facts there are. That is prediction. So you want a theory through which you can see what's coming. That is prediction. And you want to do it according to the rules. You want to do it with facts. All right. That's the scientist. Now, the scientist's friend is the mathematician who says, yes, facts. The line, the point, these are my facts. And with these facts, I am able to see through two propositions around the corner. And with those propositions, I can see them playing with corollaries. And so I can predict an equilateral triangle's existence. And I can also predict how it will be built. Inevitably. Don't believe me? Let me show you. And in showing you, I will also show you in a meta-linguistic way why the point in the line as mathematical fact must exist, and not only must exist, but must exist, here it is, for this purpose. The scientist, after his head stops spinning, says, that's a bold claim, and it sounds elegant, sure, but that's not, where does that hit the ground? I mean, you can keep saying it and saying it like a judge can take a gavel and hit the anvil. And he says, order, 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 order in the court. You as a mathematician can say, order, 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 equilateral triangles, circles, squares, oh my, from points and lines. In other words, propositions from axioms, propositions from axioms. Everyone settle down and listen as I put chalk to chalkboard and show you. But the moment I step outside a courtroom, I don't find myself in the reality of the court. You need a police force to remind me by executing justice that this reality over there that you're talking about encapsulates my reality over here on Main Street. Whereas my reality, the scientist says to the mathematician, my physical reality surrounded by facts on the ground that I can kick and throw and dismiss, that is more real because it's more expansive. I don't need a police force to tell me what hydrogen weighs at the molecular level or to enforce it. It's just there. But then the everyman, who's neither the mathematician or the scientist, their head's not swiveling, but it's going back and forth, raises his or her hand timidly, and they both say, what? What do you want? Well, I've never seen or heard what the molecular weight of hydrogen is, nor have I seen an equilateral triangle out there in space. So aren't you both saying the same thing with different words? Maybe you're both in a trance with your English syntax about how the world works. Why don't you both come down to earth? And we say, yeah, to the underdog, to the everyman. But now we, as the fourth point in the square, have to make a decision. Do we become the everyman, criticizing the mathematician and the scientist? Do we adopt the scientist's point of view, or do we try and elevate ourselves to the mathematician's purview? And so in a weird way, we find ourselves neither the everyman, the scientist, or the mathematician. And this is right where Soren Kierkegaard wants us. Because he'd say that is where existence lies, in the decision to either be yourself or not be yourself. You cannot be yourself by adopting the everyman's humor. You cannot be yourself by adopting the scientist's Wissenschaft. Or you cannot be yourself by elegantly wincing at the grossness of physical causation that is messy and full of fuzz. But in any one of those three cases, Soren Kierkegaard would say, you are failing, I am failing to realize that truth is subjectivity. That if truth is to be found, it must be found by me, by what I am. More to the point, by who I am. And the moment I substitute my who for another who, I've lost. I have not even begun. And so no matter how much time is allotted me, because it is a false me, I, even with 100 million years, will not have advanced one step. And so the choice behind the choice is the most important. Kierkegaard would say, the meta-morality, the meta-symbol, the meta-ethic, the inwardness, which Kierkegaard sees as a kind of deep journey before the journey. But notice how ironic that sounds. And he wants it to sound ironic because he lifts up Socrates as an important figure. These are the things, these are the meta turns that Kierkegaard wants to advance in his philosophy. So with that said, as the prism through which to see the light that follows and its gradations in different colors and possibilities, the parable of the soils. So to fence this parable in, why doesn't Jesus give the multitude points and lines? Why doesn't he give them this clear, elegant strategy? Why does he give them products of agriculture? Seed, ground, rock, thorns, tree, fruit, birds, types. All right. The disciples ask this question. Why do you speak to them in parables? And I was somewhere and I was walking and it occurred to me, notice what the disciples say. They don't ask him, what is a parable? Not every philosophical question has to begin with what is. And they don't ask him the aesthetic question. Oh, how do you do that? You see, you had them captivated. How did you arrange it? Did you have to put the rocky part before the thorn part? Did that build tension? They didn't ask how. So if they did not ask, how did you capture attention with a parable? And they did not ask, what is a parable? What did they ask? They asked, why do you speak to them in parables? They were asking for a reason behind the reason. They were asking for something outside of the domain of a parable, meaning they understood what a parable was. It's a story. A visual story through the ears, participating in synesthesia. You're hearing sound and seeing the sign that the sound directs your attention to without the image being there physically in front of you. This is the imaginary. They knew what a parable was and around the thing. But they're asking him, outside of that, where are you taking them? Why do you speak to them in parables? They're asking for the telos. So the disciple is standing there for us. Why this rhetorical strategy? And in answering them, Jesus quotes a prophet. This is in the Gospel of Matthew, historically understood as a gospel to Abraham's offspring, to the people of the temple, of the Torah, who knew the prophets, who heard the prophets, that also understood within this culture the argumentative strategies at play. To the question of purpose, he quotes a prophet. And at the end of the quotation, he hides the answer, or he puts the answer in a place where it can be found. Hiding doesn't have to be bad. Hiding is putting a thing in a place where it and only it can be found. The opposite of noise is hiddenness. Harmony is hidden places. So, what is at the end of the prophecy? God would heal them. And in the same moment that they would turn, and the Greek word for that turn is epistrophe, epistrophen. The epi, EPI, is the top, or the hair on your head is epi. It's on the top. When you put your hand above your eyebrows to shield the light, that shadow is epi, and the light is epi, the shadow. So you have a hierarchy. Epistrophe, to turn. So to turn back, to go up, to become stable again and originate. That is happening at the same moment, the turning back, as God healing them. So the theology and the epistemology, or the epistrophe, the theology and the epistrophe are synergistic. They're happening together. They're acting together. They're rhyming. They're coming together. And that's at the end of the quotation from the prophet. I think it's Isaiah. What's blocking the turn back? What's blocking the healing? With their eyes, they do not see. With their ears, they do not hear. And their heart has turned fat. So this image of a fat heart, clogged arteries, we might say nowadays. Well, what's blocking it? And how does the blocking relate to the symptom of the eye not seeing and the ear not hearing? Well, if we compare the end of that quotation from the prophet to the ending of the parable of the soils, Jesus says to the multitude after reciting the parable, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." So the function of an ear is to hear. Why do you speak to them in parables? What's the function of a parable? I'm of the opinion that form follows function, not function following form. So the snapping into place of an object, of a morphe, of a shape, is in effect the function taking shape. So that's why I think often in art and in engineering and in things that make sense, it's a game of iteration, of repetition with slight differences. So that original example of thinking about, when you're thinking about, you're reconstructing the idea, and you eventually stop arbitrarily because you can't go on forever. When you meet someone, or when you're reading a book, because that's kind of like meeting someone, or you see another movie, or you're walking down the street and something happens, you compare your notes with that experience, or you compare your notes with your friend's notes. Showing the two thinking abouts, showing the two constructions, is a kind of judgment call that can take place. Is your story more accurate to the original idea, or is mine? Or do both of ours both lead us way outside? Or do I need yours right after mine to keep going, and vice versa? Those questions are questions of purpose. What is this reconstruction for in this situation? Why do you speak to them in parables? What's the parable for here? What are you carving up and dividing? What are you showing? What are you representing? And Jesus gives the purpose of the healing in conjunction, synergistically, with the turning back. But that being blocked by the blockage of the eye and the ear, which are symptoms of a fat heart, of a covered heart, of a not spontaneous, not lithe, not livid, not light heart. And so now the question of purpose becomes the question of blockage, becomes the meta question of how do I hear with my ear? How do I hear the parable, not as agriculture, but as anthropology? And this has already been an hour, so forgive me. I think the parable of the soils is endless. And another reason I enjoy the parable of the soil so much is Jesus says to his disciples, similarly to Euclidean geometry and that mathematical process of deriving propositions from axioms and corollaries, he says, how will you don't understand this parable. How will you understand? How will you put together? How will you note the syntax of the other parables? If this does not click solidly, how will the others find it, meet it, and lead you further? I hear that as mathematical language, more than the language of astrophysics or facts on the ground, although I don't think it destroys the language of the scientist. In fact, I think the parable of the soils appeals to the methodological givens of the scientist. What do I mean? The sower went out to sow. We see that, even though the whole time, you have to remember, the whole time we're hearing these words. So there's not a sower in front of us sowing. We're hearing the logic and seeing the idea. This is to put ourselves in the situation. Kierkegaard would want us here. This is the cue ball. I'm the multitude hearing the logic of the idea. What will I do with it? The instrumental way of asking that is, what is my ear hearing? And is it hearing? Is it fulfilling its purpose? Is it filling full its purpose with the sound? Is it being filled up? Or is the ear being destroyed into multiplicity, becoming a multitude and not paying attention, being distracted, thinking it's the eye, confusing itself with other instruments? It's very powerful, actually, how dense and deep and how much is called for in a scientific observation. One needs to seek to find. I think so. The Lord says, knock and it will be open, seek and you will find. But again, it can't be something that I say, it has to be something that I do. But doing in this instance is hearing, because in the parable of the soils, if one buys that it's like the construction of an equilateral triangle in Euclidean geometry, it's like the starting move in a game of chess. What you do with your pawn structure at the beginning of chess dictates to a very high percentage what will become of the rest of the pieces, and eventually what happens at the end. Who wins? In the same way, how I progress in my understanding of the parable of the soils, I think will dictate what I make of the other parables and what I make of the mystery in the long run. Everything I've said here cannot be divorced from experience, because if it is divorced from experience, it becomes, I think, word salad. It becomes the accident of me knowing English, because anyone else could say these things in a different language. So contemplation cannot be divorced from action. And I think that's why another way of understanding he who has ears, let him hear is said at the end of the parable. It's not something that can just be written down, put away in a book, and walked away from so that we play backgammon. It has to be heard. In other words, it has to be participated in. We have to engage with it indefinitely. We have to study it. We have to go through it, not comparing ourselves to others. Because as Kierkegaard would say, it's about the journey before the journey. It's about inwardness. It's about letting it sink in, which is freedom. Because when you're not comparing yourself to others, when you're allowing things to take shape, when you're participating with the world, with God, insofar as one can, where one is, then one is normal. And then what happens is the icing on the cake, is spontaneity, is reality of life. And so normal walks with spontaneity together. The last thing I'll say is there's a part in the parable of the soils where he gives 4 different categories, 4 different manifestations. The seed that lands on the wayside, birds come and take it. The seed that lands in the rocky soil, not much depth, comes up, the sun withers it. The seed hits the ground, has nice depth, comes up, it's choked out by the weeds. And then the 4th one lands in good soil, has depth, comes up, bears fruit. There's so much going on there conceptually. One thing that I think is going on there symbolically is being consistent with the idea that the multitude is being spoken to through the ear and seeing with their eyes or their imagination what the audio projects: tree, ground, rock, seed, wayside, bird. This synesthesia is recapitulating the problem of the heart being blocked and the symptom of the eye not seeing and the ear not hearing. It's bringing into its own shape the problem and the solution. It's not a conveyor belt to take us somewhere else. It's showing us everything we need to see if we will hear it. In other words, the way it canvasses this problem is by analogy. So the ground and the tree coming up, look at that ground as a line, a horizontal line through the middle. And the problem is the tree above and the roots below, that line, that surface, that division between what? I would say symbolically, that line is the division between the eye and the ear. The seed hits the ground, hits that line, and when it makes roots, it's going into the ear, the sound, the logic that is carried by the acoustic. When the tree comes up, you're seeing something. through the eye. And the dynamic process of these two things composing themselves or not, in the case of the one that comes up too soon with enthusiasm, you see it. It's like a good idea you just had and you're excited about. Wow, all these things are coming together. It's wonderful. The moment the sun comes up, which also has a symbolic valence, it withers. Why? Because it didn't really, we say, sink in. The logic with the sound, which is not the same thing as that bright idea, hasn't what? Hasn't made stable the possibility. So we're seeing this dynamic in effect through the types, through the word picture, the sound image of the parable. And we see a continuum in the parable. Aristotle said distance is the middle between two extremes, which I think is lovely. Distance is the middle between two extremes. So this continuum has the distance of the opposite, the ground not being deep enough, not hearing the logic, but seeing some consequence. That won't do. Hearing the logic, but seeing yourself in competition with all these others, which also have their roots in the ground, which means they also have the logic that they've heard, which is to say the logic that they've heard is sharing space with the logic of what you have just heard. Simplifying. That also will choke the idea, will choke the actual possibility taking shape, taking body. And on the ends of this continuum is the good, the tree that comes up with roots. The eye and the ear have brought the logic into dynamic representation through the fruit that society tastes, that the world experiences, that is more than the sum of the parts of the composition of eye and ear. That is the fulfillment of the sower's sowing, the sower's intention. All in freedom, without anything being confused. The root doesn't become the tree doesn't become the root, and the growth, the product of this, which is not the crushing of either one in competition, is the fruit, which is neither the tree nor the ground, because you can pluck the fruit from the tree and walk away. But without the ground, without hearing the logic, without seeing the idea, this thing known as the fruit, which is neither one of them, could not exist. The equilateral triangle could not exist without the line and the point. The proposition could not exist without the axiom. And the existence of the equilateral triangle of the fruit could not exist without the demonstration, which is the movement of teasing out of the axiom this effect, this product. All of that, without confusion, can be done in freedom. And so when we find ourselves as the everyman or the scientist or the mathematician in freedom, we don't have to confuse ourselves with any of them, but we can move through them and become them, and then return to ourselves with fruit. The fruit of that encircling the idea, the point, reality of the truth, of our experience. So never divorcing the experience from the intellect, from the contemplation. Unfortunately, I can't do justice to what I am trying to say. It sounds very wordy. I wish I could say it simply. I wish I could say it powerfully. But alas, I said what I said. And I will continue thinking about this, perhaps. But for now, I'm done. I think I will grab a bite to eat and move on with the day. Thank you for your time. And thank you for the comments. It'll be interesting to see where we go from here. I hope you have a good day.